So, yes, as we all know, as Christians, whether or not we've always been Christians or had an experience of having been a non-Christian and become a Christian, either side of that fence, you're still going to be suffering. It doesn't clear you of that. And when I was thinking about this, the fact that we follow, as Christians in the definition, follow Jesus, what did Jesus experience? Well, he suffered. So probably a pretty good chance if we're following the path of Jesus, we too are going to be experiencing suffering. He suffered the loss of a friend, wept at the death of Lazarus. Certainly, anticipating the crucifixion and what he was going to suffer through that process. And to the point of really, that line, my God, why have you forsaken me? It wasn't, sort of like, oh, I'm just going through this short thing and I know it's going to be better. I mean, he was immersed in that suffering wholly. And then after Christ, we look to his followers and his disciples, and they suffered too. Peter, again, the weeping, realizing that he had betrayed Jesus and how that hurt him. Thinking about Mary, who was chosen as the mother of God, like, she's great. And she has to be there at the foot of the cross, seeing her son go through the crucifixion. That's suffering. And then we hear about Paul in his letters, suffering, imprisonment, hunger. He speaks often in his letters about this physical thorn that he carried with him that he felt was something, unique to his experience. So he was immersed in that suffering. Who else in Christian history can you guys, do you look to for company in our suffering?
I think a shorter list is who can't you in Christian history.
Jeremiah was sort of a gloomy prophet who had tough experiences, but hung in there with God. He suffered. I mean, he was treated shabbily, but he also seemed to have inner torment. But he still held in there.
And certainly Job, we can't really have a discussion about suffering that doesn't include Job, who, Christian or not, his name as an example of someone who suffered blamelessly. And through that book, Job laments to God, questioning what's happening to him. And it's interesting, the longest speech from God is in Job, chapters 38 to 41. It's a long speech. When God chooses to speak to us the longest, it's about suffering. And pretty much like, where were you when I created all this stuff? Were you there when I created the sea, when I separated heaven from earth? You weren't. You don't know what's going on. I know what's going on. Don't worry about it. Which probably didn't make Job feel a lot better at the time, maybe at the very end when everything got returned to him. But that's God's message. I've got control over this stuff, and it's not for you. And that to me brings to mind the quote I have here from Isaiah 55, 8-9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. That's certainly something that comes to mind, anytime I'm asking questions about God or faith. Those verses are right there in my head. And then why do we suffer? When I was first starting to write this, and I had mentioned this at the beginning, like, okay, so if I'm a follower of Jesus Christ and Jesus suffered, then I'm going to suffer too. Why would I think that I would be any better off than Jesus? Jesus, was God and man. I'm just this mere human. Of course, I'm going to suffer. And then I realized I do actually have it a lot better than Jesus. And most of us in our suffering have it better than what Jesus went through. We're not being crucified for the sins of all humanity, now and evermore. So that sort of made me think, well, so is that suffering a part of Jesus's humanity, or is his suffering a reflection of his divinity? Is our suffering because we're human, or is our suffering because we have, each of us, that spark of the divine in us, and that suffering is a reflection of that? But does anybody ever thought that
That's a
before?
deep question.
I was gonna say that.
Yeah.
That is really deep.
I think the answer is yes.
Yeah.
It makes me think of in Philippians, Paul talks about how he longs to share in the fellowship of his sufferings. And so he's talking about that he wants his sufferings to mirror the sufferings of Christ. And certainly there are ways that we suffer that aren't necessarily attached to the sufferings of Christ. I mean, we might suffer because we get in a car accident, our leg gets broken, we get an infection, and we have to endure everything that comes from that. Or we might suffer because we sin, we make a bad choice, and there are consequences associated with that. But the fellowship of sharing in Christ's sufferings seems different than that. It seems more like the suffering that comes about from attempting to live a righteous life. Although I guess as I talk that out loud, I mean, Jesus suffered because he was hungry, because he was tired. So there were certainly elements of his suffering that we might say aren't spiritual, right? Yeah.
But I think also Jesus's suffering is largely rooted in love, or was motivated by love. These sacrifices were made out of love for us, and maybe that's something that we don't quite understand, how love played a role in that, and the willingness to suffer.
We take aside, there's physical pain, from a car accident or illness or whatever. But generally, this is an overstatement, I'm sure. But if those are kinds of suffering that you can kind of deal with, but when it's complicated with feeling that nobody cares, or I don't have a connection, or I'm being a burden on somebody, you have all those other kind of emotional entanglements that go along with it, then it seems to me it goes from being pain to being suffering. I kind of, those meld together, but I kind of see those as somewhat different from other. So there's that sense of about relationship, and that to me is divine. That's a part of our sense of, we talk about a combination of having some divinity within us. I think we have that part of us that's godlike in us is naturally a part of being in relationship with others. And then those relationships going askew, or not quite trusting them, or feeling lost because of them, or not feeling regarded, because those are the things that lead us to suffering. If it was just plain old pain, it would be different. Then it wouldn't have that God quality to it.
So like the difference between a physical pain
Mhm.
and an emotional suffering.
Mhm.
I think, I'm looking at 1 Peter 2, talking about, but if you suffer for doing good and endure, it is commendable for God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you. And there's a sense that sometimes when you do good, you just will not get good from it. But there is something, I'll say, divine about that. There's a feeling of, that you're in that with Jesus. I kind of think that may be what Paul's talking about. I want to, conform to his suffering, sharing his sufferings, that suffering, the doing good and not always getting good in return. That there's something kind of divine about that.
I'm not, what is that phrase about the good intentions? Apparently not coming to any of us right now.
Just the road to hell. But I don't think that's the one.
It's funny, I was taught that the road to hell was paved with waste. So there might be several roads to hell paved with this.
Highway, it's easy to get there.
And I think that one of the things that comes to mind too, and Debbie, your comments sort of touched on it a little bit in terms of thinking about a purpose that our suffering might serve. That surely the crucifixion was easier for Jesus to endure, knowing that he was going through it to purchase our freedom from sin. And going through this last almost 2 years now of COVID, if we had been told at the beginning, it's going to be X amount of time.
Yeah.
You know, some of sitting in our houses last March was difficult because we didn't know how long that was going to last. You know, when you think about the Israelites in exile for 40 years. 40 years. 40 is kind of one of those biblical numbers that maybe means it was a little longer. But 40 years, it's finite. Those Israelites living through that had no idea that it was going to be 40 years. We had no idea March last year, March of 2020, even before last year, that COVID was still going to be something impacting our day-to-day lives today. And would it be easier suffering through that, knowing how long it was going to last, or knowing what purpose it could serve?
I think in regard to the concept of suffering, and it kind of brings back to what Dale was talking about in the bulletin when he was talking about certainty. So when you're suffering, there is that concept we're talking about of uncertainty, unpredictability, feeling disconnected, feeling out of control. So to me, that whether it's a physical issue or an emotional issue, or yes, both, they're often both connected, as they certainly have been for me. Knowing that there's a purpose, I do think could be beneficial. Knowing that it has a timeline and it has an ending, yes, I do think that it can be beneficial because it helps to mitigate some of that uncertainty, some of that sense of, oh, I'm disconnected now. I don't know where my feet are on the ground, but in time, I will be able to reestablish X, Y, or Z. So I do think that those things would help in regard to lessening the suffering. As a physical therapist, what I'm doing with a client is I'm trying to help them understand what's going on, to give them an environment, to give them a map to some degree towards something or another, which in and of itself can be beneficial and help them be, and it also helps the relationship. So I like the piece about what was being said before about being connected. Maybe that's the divine piece about reestablishing connection to ourselves, connection to each other, connection to our God. Maybe that's the divinity in it.
And so I think part of that is, can we make our suffering easier, viewing it as a part of God's plan and with God's purpose, even if we don't know what it is? It's Isaiah, your ways are not my ways, but you've got a way. And I'm going to trust that at the end of X, it'll be achieved, whether or not it's step 1 of 10, 20 of 1,000. It's a part of the plan. One of my favorite quotes that I have taped to my desk is, every act of creation is first of all an act of destruction. I came across it when I was going through Everett's infancy, which was a time of struggle and suffering for both of us, probably lots of people in our family too. And that quote helped me see the suffering and destruction of my days as part of a bigger picture. And I prayed for God to do something from the misery, just so long as I know that there's something that is something later that is going to make this make sense or seem to have had a purpose, helped me get through that. What are touchstones that some of you have that bring you through those dark moments and dark days, whether they're biblical or it's a little piece that I cut out of a magazine that's still taped there.
Well, I think rote prayers, I've known about Psalm 23 from the time I probably first went to Sunday school or something. But I didn't actually memorize it till lately. The last few years. And being able to have a repertoire of those kinds of things in your mind, you don't need to look them up. They're there for whenever you need them. That's helpful. I find St. Teresa's prayer of calm to be fundamentally good. I think exercise is good. I think exercise is particularly good because it gives you agency. It's something you can do. The day may not have gone the way I wanted it to go, but I did get that in. And I think remembering that you have choice, that you may be suffering quite awfully. But you still have a choice in how you're going to respond to it. You can, the book, The Choice by a woman named Edgar, Holocaust survivor, Auschwitz survivor, saying you can't control what will happen to you always. And often you can't. More often than not, you can't really control. But you can control how you will respond. First choice you make, you can still choose to help others. Find some ways you can find meaning in that. You can still choose joy, is the point of the book. But for when I'm looking at your question here, it's just choice. Remember choice. And that's so important to remember. I still have agency here. I feel like everything's out of control, but it's not really. You still have choice on what you're going to do about this.
Julie's got her hand up, and Kathy.
Yeah. I'm sorry, but and I think Chris, you led us sort of spiritual exercise one time that I found really helpful, which is think about all the positive outcomes of a certain situation. Hold them in your hands and just think about them and just let them go. Before God, think about the worst outcomes and do the same thing. Hold on to them, then let it go. And I think that's a real powerful way of dealing with suffering or dealing with outcomes and what could happen, and recognizing even the best possible outcomes you need to let go and the worst possible outcomes you need to let go, and to know that that can be transformed by God either way.
Yeah. For me, the first thing is empathy. We've talked about how everybody suffers. Well, our own suffering is what creates empathy for other people, so that we actually can say, not that we ever experience somebody's things totally, but you can say, okay, I know what it is to have chronic pain, or have your husband die, have somebody have cancer, or whatever. The minute this happens to you, you suddenly have a world of opening into all the other people that are suffering that same way, and they have an opening to you. You have a bond here, and I just look at it as a way to go through life, like bonding with this group and that group and whatever. And there's been numerous times when I thought, oh, well, you've come into contact with me, and actually, because of my history, I'm not that I'm a good person to talk to right now about whatever, because I went through that in my own life, and I can, and it was helpful. So not saying you're the be all and end all, but you're just part of a new community.
And that's interesting in what you had said as well, Debbie, and sort of that relationship. And if the divinity is found in those relationships, that broadening of your suffering broadens your relationships and deepens the sense of community and divinity.
To the question of what kind of touchstones. Somewhere last year, I was teaching the girls on Sunday morning, and preparing for that, I don't know where this thought came up. I remember sharing it with the girls. Was we were talking about Paul, and that he was imprisoned, and yet he wrote the book of Philippians, and was full of joy, and he was writing those to the people in Philippi, and expressing how much joy, and yet he was suffering in prison, and I said part of his suffering was that he couldn't be out doing the thing that he thought God wanted him to do. He thought his purpose in life was to be out traveling and teaching and preaching. And here he spent a large part of his missionary time. Why was that? Well, how could he look at that and think, is this really what God wants for me? But if he hadn't been in prison, he wouldn't have written those letters, and we wouldn't be reading them now. So he couldn't even think of that possibility. He couldn't think about 2,000 some years later, Debbie Paul sitting in Stamford, Connecticut, was going to profit from my being in prison. And yet that's the truth of it. We profited by his suffering. And so sometimes if we suffer well, I think you get to that a little bit later, if we suffer well, we may be benefiting people we don't even know exist.
Yeah, and that's part of what I was saying before, like what we're suffering might be step 20 in an 1,000-step plan that Paul would have no idea, was going to result in our community of faith based so much of the New Testament on his epistles.
I also think human lives go through waves of events, right? Good days, bad days, some suffering. And as we age and have our share of suffering cycles, we hopefully learn that too will pass, and that we're not alone, and God will help us, will spare us, will save us from these events that occur. Maybe we're gonna be different, but we're gonna get through it. And maybe that's one of the gifts of aging, just having the confidence that, it's going to be okay. We got it under control. People are going to help me. Our God is going to come to my rescue.
Yeah, and for a broader perspective than you have when my 12-year-old son upset about missing one question on the French test. I think it'll work out. So historically, one of the assumed purposes of suffering, I think oftentimes, is punishment. And Job's friends certainly, were super helpful for him during his trials, saying, think really hard. You must have done something. Surely this isn't happening, for no reason at all. You must have done something and you're just not remembering it. And to me, I think, based on what I have learned about God and what I've come to know, I view him as a loving God. And the idea that the suffering is a form of punishment, especially as we're having this really engaging conversation tonight about some of the relationships that the suffering allows, is this part of knowing a loving God, someone who passes down punishment, or is that more of a judgmental God? And how does your interpretation of who God is shape how you interpret your suffering? And then we'll go ahead and go on to, sorry.
No, me.
Oh, I thought you were pointing to the
It's,
screen, yeah.
No, I mean, yeah, it's fundamental what your image of, of God is, but I think there's something that human beings need to kind of be. I mean, I've noticed a pattern when something unexpectedly bad happens to somebody. It seems to me, I know I do this. It seems to me other people do it too. We look for the wrong they did. And we do that to protect ourselves because we surely would not do that wrong. And so that won't happen to me because I, after all, wouldn't make that mistake. And that's part of, it's not really punishing God, but we immediately look for blame as a protection against the likelihood that we too might suffer. But no, I wouldn't do that. So that won't happen to me.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I'm sure that's what Job's friends were wanting to
Right.
know. Tell me what terrible thing you did so that I know not to do that and end up in that same spot.
Right. Right. It's a false sense of security, in, isn't it? And I think about that. That happens a lot too with people who get sick. I do find that that people want to know, like, well, they really didn't have that great of a lifestyle. We make all of these excuses, or it's really, like Dale said, to protect ourselves, and to give us some sense of security that somehow we ourselves have control over things that happen.
Before we move on, I also want to observe that suffering is part of God's plan. And I don't think in very specific ways. It's not like this happened because God intended that to happen, but he creates a universe, he creates reality where people are going to suffer, and a lot of suffering, not all suffering, but a lot of suffering is redemptive. By which I mean the lessons you learn through the suffering. There's an Arabian proverb that says all sunshine makes a desert, and that's you occasionally run into a person that's just lived this privileged, blessed life, and it seems. Sometimes you're wrong in that. You make some assumptions that aren't true, but there's also something missing in that person. They haven't had that. Maybe it's what Kathy's talking about. They haven't had the experience to be empathetic. And Scott, just for the record, since every time this topic comes up, Scott will say, none of us want the suffering to come, but none of us want to be the person we were before the suffering came. And that's almost always true. Maybe not always, but so yeah, you don't want it to happen. But you think back to the person you were before that happened and said, no, I don't want to be that person. I want to be the person who is a little wiser now, a little more experienced. Yeah.
Just to add on that, when we step into the valley of the shadow of death, we're not exactly sure what's going to happen. When we emerge from it, we know, and we know the power of the experience. So it's really what Dale just said, but there's a big difference between the beginning and the end.
But in this discussion, there is a place to talk about consequences. Yeah, and sometimes we suffer because of the consequences of other people's actions. Sometimes we suffer because of the consequences of our own actions. And I think for me, when I started to learn the difference between a consequence of my action and a punishment for my action, there's that redemptive quality to it. Yes, I may have done something and I'm suffering from the consequences of that, but I can still learn from this and I can still be forgiven and I am not lost.
And that's separating the sinner from the sin, and that, I've done something bad, but I am not bad. But I understand that that behavior was not the best choice.
Yeah.
So if we're all going to go through the valley of the shadow of death, how do we do it as well as we can? So I sort of look at it as we accept suffering, we accept this life, the joys that it brings, the pain that it brings, as an act of faith in a loving God that perhaps has Paul in prison so that we have letters later, so that I suffer through depression as a new mom so that I can be effective in recognizing that in my children when they get older, that there are opportunities for growth from those things. And I think one idea too is, because if we look at suffering as something that we know is going to happen, instead of kind of going through life like hopefully not, hopefully not, hopefully not. And it reminds me of some of the things you talked about in your sermon on Sunday, Chris, where you live your life burning the candle at both ends, and you are stretched and you are stretched, and you can make it work if everything goes perfectly. Guess what? It doesn't. It's not going to. So how are you going to make choices so that when that suffering comes, instead of it snapping and breaking what you're stretched to manage, that you make your things a little bit smaller, maybe, so that when that suffering comes, and it's gonna come, that you've got some sort of like extra energy in the tank to handle it. I had put in here sort of like, you have your budget for the month, and you're going to have utilities and rent and some entertainment. And sometimes those envelopes get used up every month. Sometimes there's a little extra, but you save that suffering envelope, and you get to the end of the month and you're like, I didn't really need that much this month. This is a good month. Put it in the envelope for next month. Roll those minutes over, add that stuff up, so that when you get to the point that it comes, you have more of an allowance for it. You sort of look in that envelope and you're like, oop, yep, I knew this is coming because it's in here. I think of it too, like on my way here tonight, I plan to leave my house at 6:30. It's about a 13-minute drive here, so I should have been here by 6:45. Was anyone here at 6:45? Was I here, Chris? I was not here. I was not here.
I was beginning to worry when it was 6:55.
Yes, by Google said that I got here at 6:57. So I did not manage my trip here with margin. I needed to make sure that I hit every light, that there wasn't something in front of me going too slow. I didn't manage that well. As I was driving here, I was like, yeah, this is what I was talking about. This is that margin that I did not leave for myself.
You needed it for class. It's perfect.
So thinking about how often we do that in life, whether it's trying to get that last thing in before the next thing, just kind of making room in life for margin. And that also makes room for God. It gives us the opportunity to take a nap, and store up some energy, recharge our batteries. It gives us the chance to say, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and let that car make that left turn in front of me. That's fine, because I've left myself enough time to get where I need to be so that I can be more generous and giving in those small things in life. And then one of the other things that comes to mind too, that I think is a challenge for us as Christians, is to live like Paul says in Philippians here. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. So we're not only happy and joyful when things are going well. You know, that when people look at us as Christians, that we have that joy, that peace, that, you know, something that they see in us isn't only there when the sun is shining. It's there when it's on the rainy days too.
Kristen, I remember I spent a lot of time with Tamari when he was very sick. And the wonder of Tamari was you just, I knew he was dying right before my eyes, but he didn't focus on that. He always asked how I was doing. And he always had this spirit of love and interest in other people about him. He didn't, at least when I saw him, he didn't dwell on the fact that terrible things were going on in his body. He dwelt on everybody else around him. And he always had a smile. It was an amazing experience, actually. It was quite, his suffering was a gift to me, just to witness how it was done.
Anybody else?
You know, sometimes when I think about suffering and in this room, yeah, pretty much everybody's heard me complain about my suffering. Debbie and Dale probably had the lion's share of that. The thing about questioning God, and you know, you were talking before about an all-loving God, and Dale knows this. I mean, I screamed it out practically in the middle of Starbucks. Like, how could an all-loving God, you know, have this be happening? How, I don't get it. I don't get it. What's going on? And Dale said one of the most loving things to me. He said, you know, Annie, he goes, I don't know of anybody who's wrestled with their faith who hasn't said exactly what you said. And that was really comforting to me. It was a comfort that I am not alone. And I think as I've gotten to a better place about suffering and the concept of suffering for myself, the first thing is, you were saying before, you know, you try to manage all these things, keep it at bay, but it's just acknowledging. It's that living in the present moment, acknowledging this is a problem that I do not like. Something is happening. It's just really just acknowledging and say, maybe it's okay for other people, but this isn't okay for me. And allowing yourself to be okay with that. Be okay that you are not okay with whatever it is. Because for different people, it may not be so bad, or it may be worse. But that doesn't really matter because it's happening to you. And then as Dale was saying, you know, and you were saying, actually, you all said, actually, we have choice. So how are you going to deal with that? But you can't go to a place of saying you have choice unless you acknowledge where you are. And you have to have an acknowledgement, and then you can take the step of saying, okay, I have choice here now, because I now know what I'm going to choose, what I'm going to be thinking about choosing. And for me, the piece where the divinity that we were talking about from the way beginning comes in is that choice. Is how is the divinity going to enter there? Is that choice through things that I need to do? Does it mean that I have to reach out? And sometimes it comes through that lesson or through that experience of reaching, how it does connect me, how it does help me relate to others, how it helps me relate in the world. And it's like this process that happens. But for me, the biggest thing was that acknowledgement, just saying, it's okay that you feel pretty lousy about this thing. It's okay. Be okay with it. Allow yourself to be okay that you don't feel okay. And then that allows you the next steps. And probably one of the best things my therapist said to me was, when you're really having a tough time, I want you to do something for someone else. Get yourself out of your own way. And that's also been a very helpful thing to help me get out of my own suffering. And it just puts things in perspective, I think, but I think it brings you into that relationship, and it brings you into that divinity, which elevates your humanity all at the same time.
And I think, Dale, you had talked in a series last year, or at some point about that, sort of letting go of the ego of the self and engaging with other people. And that if it's all going to be here, it's all going to be here, and it's going to be kind of awful and nasty, because you're only focused on your own stuff. But if you're engaged and you're in relationship, that's where, what seems so big, it's a speck. It's not the 2x4, it's a speck. But if you're just staring at it all day, it looks enormous. So, and again, for me, the loving God, and I have faith that this is not the end game. This is, what happens here concerns us right now, because it's all we know. But it's not where we're going to be. And from Revelation 21:3-4, and I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." So any other comments, thoughts to share?
Here's a quote I don't have down exact, but from the poet Rilke. Talks about, let it all happen to you, the beauty and the terror, the good and the bad. No feeling is final. I'm reminded because you said it's not final. And that's extremely important to remember. No feeling is final. I may feel awful now, but that feeling's going to pass. And there'll be another feeling. You'll feel awful again sometime, but no feeling is final. The euphoria is not final, and neither is the despair.
I think of James 1:2. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever, not if, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete. And I want to be mature and complete.
So people talk about COVID and character building. I like my character just fine. It doesn't need any more.
I think Eddie's saying his does.
I think Eddie's a lot more right than I am. I'm sure that he's building up too.
But that old adage, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. There's a lot to that. When you break a bone and that bone heals, you won't ever break there again. You cut that bone goes back stronger at that spot. So I know that everything that I'm going to go through will make me stronger in that area. And even though I don't look forward to that, on the other side of that, I become uniquely qualified, to help others. As you did in your postpartum or whatever, some young mother is going to come to you, and you're going to have a special understanding and a special insight that I could never give that person. But you can speak to that, and you will be heard more differently and more deeply. than someone who just can do it on it, talk about it abstractly.
Mhm. All right, so what Kathy was saying in terms of empathy and being part of these communities of suffering. All right, so don't ever ask me to do this again. It's really hard.
Be strong.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Turn it over now back to you, Chris, or are we?
We're all done. We're grateful for everybody being here. We'll leave the online open for a little bit if you want to chat. Okay.
Great job. Thank